Thank you all so much, and thank you to Sue and Renee and Bridget and everyone who helped me get here and help me put this presentation together. I don't have anything to disclose as far as my financial relationships. I have very few financial relationships, sadly. But what I want to do today is just try to help you all as people out in the field identify common types of abuse, neglect, and exploitation, as well as possible interventions. And I have a pretty intense presentation as far as the number of slides I have for you, and I'm probably not going to get through them all. But what I wanted to do was to have you have the handout for future reference should you need it. So I'm going to focus most on some general facts about abuse, neglect, and exploitation, and a case example I'll be talking about, and then what you can do. And I'll focus a little bit less on red flags and things like that because you have that in your handout. But if something pressing comes up for you as we're going, raise your hand. I'll try to address it then. And if not, I'll address it at the end, and I'll be here later on as well and can talk to you then. So I work with 2.5. I'm one of 2.5 full-time prosecutors in King County. The other half person does other crimes as well. But together we are prosecuting really all of the elder financial exploitation cases that come to us. We're a county of about 2 million people, as well as all the adult neglect cases, some physical abuse, some sexual assault, and some homicides. The 2.5 of us cannot prosecute all the cases that come in. It's more cases than we can handle, so the rest of our office handles many of them. But we also, as part of our jobs, train first responders, and most importantly, the medical community, because they are, to me, the most important partners we have in not only helping us identify these cases, but also helping us respond to them properly. And we also work on improving the systemic response to elder abuse in our county and in other counties in Washington. So I'm going to talk to you about a case example, and I just want to warn you that the pictures I'm going to show are very graphic and difficult. If anyone does not feel like looking at this, you can't deal with it, just look away for a minute or two. It won't take long. I do this because I just think it's incredibly important for us to be looking this issue in the face. And this case requires that. So this case involves a woman named Ruby Wise. This is a case I prosecuted a few years ago. She was 85 years old at the time I got the case. She had been living with her son, Christopher, who is 41, in a rural part of King County, my county. He called 911 to report his mother's death. He said it was expected. He was crying. He sounded very appropriate on the phone. Some volunteer firefighters came to the scene, so volunteer EMTs. They noted nothing unusual, but as a matter of policy, they reported the death to law enforcement. Patrol officers arrived and they found a very different scene than what they'd heard from the EMTs. And I think it's because EMTs went in there, saw that she was dead, and didn't look any further. So they saw Ruby's body, and she was covered up. When they first saw her on the dresser in the foreground of that picture, you can see there was bug spray and room deodorizer. And when they pulled back the sheets, they saw her body completely emaciated with a clean diaper on, but everything else, there was no terrible hygiene, just, pressure sores, just the worst possible condition, and clearly had been dead for at least a day. This is just a pressure sore on her hip. You can see feces in her thighs, bruising, going up and down her legs. This was not someone who had gotten good care in any sense of the word. So this was a case that we'd received a fair number of cases like this to our office during the time we've been in existence. So over the decades that we've been in doing prosecution, we had never prosecuted a case like this before because historically these cases have been perceived of as being, caregiving issues, family matters, civil matters, but not something the criminal justice system should deal with. And so we'd never prosecuted a case like this before. But then I was appointed to this position of elder abuse prosecutor, and during that time I had a pretty serious education on what's criminal and what's not criminal, and on the need for us to be treating cases that are criminal with the criminal justice system, not by looking the other way and saying, oh, they're just old, or they have dementia, so this isn't something the criminal justice system should deal with. So I worked with a detective as he investigated the case, and we worked it up as a potential homicide. I'm just going to keep the facts very bare bones, but I hope this will be enough to make the point. But what Christopher said was that he was his mom's sole caregiver. He admitted she was bedbound. He admitted she had dementia. He himself was an unemployed software engineer. He was educated. He had no addictions that we were aware of, except maybe playing poker on his computer. And he admitted that he was living off of Ruby's income. And he said that that was the agreement they had, that he would take care of her as she got older, and in return, he wouldn't have to work. So he was definitely dependent on her income for his livelihood. What we found besides those things I just told you through the investigation was that he had no other income beside his mom's. We also found that he had a couple of friends he would see, and one of them had aging parents, and she had cared for them. And she went out of her way to offer him long-term care for his mother, and even in-home care, and even hospice care as her health deteriorated. And he had turned down every one of those possibilities. And he said at the time, well, Ruby wanted me to be just me and her, me alone with her. And what I really think was happening was that he didn't want to divert her income into either, a facility, in which case he would have lost everything probably, or even in-home care, which would have meant he would have lost a large portion of the monthly income they were getting. What we also found in the home were journals where Ruby had talked about the pain she was in, where she had talked about her doctors, where she had every day written down her pulse and her blood pressure, very devoted to her health care and very concerned about her health condition. And she would say things like, someone needs to tend to me, I need doctors, I can't see anymore. Really sad, plaintive notes in her journal that indicated that she was living a very lonely, uncomfortable, painful life for much of the time, at least the last several months of her life. And what we also found by getting records of his primary care provider was that Christopher had stopped taking Ruby to her primary care provider, that the PCP had recommended a number of follow-up treatments. As you can imagine, she had lots of different things going on. She had vision issues, hearing issues, she had heart issues, lots of different health problems. And he had recommended a number of different follow-up things, as well as coming back to him so that he could keep seeing Ruby and monitoring her care. And he didn't take her back. He took her a couple of times, and then Christopher never brought her back again. And eventually the doctor cut off her heart medications because Christopher wouldn't bring wouldn't bring Ruby into the doctor anymore. So we know that at some point Ruby was off all of her medications, and Christopher was just buying over-the-counter medications for her. We also found these earplugs in the living room on a couch very close to Ruby's bedroom, and Christopher admitted that he put the earplugs in to block out the sounds of Ruby's wailing. The autopsy report found that Ruby weighed at about 72 pounds at the time of death. I think when she was in her prime, she was about 150 pounds. Her height at the time of death, was 4 feet 10 inches. She had cerebral atrophy. Does that mean anything to any of you all? Yeah, what does it mean? What do you think of when you think about that? Dementia, right. She was dehydrated, emaciated, she had kidney failure, and she had severe pressure sores on numerous parts of her body that were infected and septic, and she also had osteomyelitis, so the infection had gone into her bones. The cause of death, our medical examiner found, was multiple deep pressure ulcers due to immobilization in bed. The manner of death, and that's what medical examiners or coroners say, is either homicide, suicide, natural, or undetermined. He said was undetermined because he felt like it was beyond his purview to make that determination between whether it was self-neglect or neglect. That was up to the jury to decide. And that was okay, we dealt with that. So that was what we had. We also had lots of financial records and interviews with neighbors. And what the neighbors told us was that they could hear Ruby crying and wailing, and that they had called their mutual landlord. They rented a house, and Christopher rented a house from the same person, and they had called him to complain. And he had reached out to Christopher, and Christopher said, "Don't worry, I'm getting a nurse, it's going to be fine." And no one had called Adult Protective Services, no one had called police, despite what was probably months of Ruby wailing. So I'm going to go on now, we'll come back to this later. But I want to talk to you generally about elder abuse. And I've been doing this work now for about 20 years. And so I have to say, you all, I see the darkest of the dark of cases, right? The cases we prosecute are the ones that are very much on the far end of the spectrum, So forgive me if I'm a bit of a downer, but I do think it's only by looking at these cases head on and really thinking about them that we're going to address the entire spectrum of abuse and neglect that goes on in this country. What we know is that elder abuse comes in many forms. These are the different forms that we see. And what we often see are things like neglect and financial exploitation co-occurring. We also see that we see physical abuse and financial exploitation co-occurring as well. Sexual abuse less often, but that happens sometimes too, along with financial exploitation. But financial exploitation seems to be the one that runs along many forms of abuse and that co-occurs most frequently. We also know it's most often committed by someone the victim trusts. Family members, by far the most often, caregivers, usually paid caregivers, but often family members who are also caregivers. We see financial exploitation by faith leaders, by guardians and powers of attorney, financial advisors. And then we see a fair number of cases in Washington, and I think this is true in Montana as well, of strangers who identify someone in their community as being vulnerable and lonely, and then they befriend that person and gain their trust in order to exploit them. I'm seeing some nods. I think you guys this might be familiar to some people. And we know that elder abuse is a growing crisis in this country. 10,000 people turn 65 every day and will do so during the next 17 years. 10% will be victims of some other form of elder abuse like neglect, physical or sexual abuse, and 20% will be victims of financial exploitation. In Montana, we know that in 2020, 4,500 Montanans were reported to be victims, an increase of 30% since 2018. And last year, 4,900 reported being victimized, an increase of 9% from 2020. And this is just a fraction of what's really going on out there. We think that for every one case that's reported, another 23 never come to light. And what I've seen in my practice, especially with regard to financial exploitation, is that many of the victims that we see are men. And I think that's most often with financial exploitation. With sexual abuse, we definitely see more women, but we do see male victims as well. With physical abuse, we also see both genders, but probably more women than men. But very often these people who are victimized also are grieving. The number of people who are widows or widowers who are then abused is very, very high in our caseload. Often they have some health problems. They may have some confusion, some mild cognitive impairment, or moderate cognitive impairment. It just sort of depends on what the form of abuse is that they're experiencing, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But almost always we see a thread of loneliness in their lives, isolation, and just an inability to really feel like they have a community they can talk to and they can rely on. These are just some of the reasons that we see for why people don't report when they're victimized. It's hard to rank these, and this is all purely anecdotal from my experience, but I think fear of losing independence is really a primary reason people don't want to report. They're terrified and legitimately that if they admit to being exploited or being abused, that means they've got dementia, that means they're going to end up in a nursing home. And many people really would rather submit to whatever it is they're going through versus giving up their home and ending up in a facility. So I think that becomes a real disincentive for them to report. We also see a lot of cases where they love the perpetrator, where they are in a relationship. It's their son or their grandson or their daughter. And that person, while is taking advantage of them or abusing them, but their choice, again, is, do I have this relationship or am I totally alone in a facility? And they may choose to stay in that relationship. And then dementia, again, may cause people to not recognize what's happening to them, to feel confused about it, to have a hard time feeling like they really have the agency to respond and to stand up for themselves. As far as LGBTQ+ elders, we know they're at even higher risk of elder abuse. They may be even more socially isolated. They often are afraid of coming out or afraid of a homophobic response by the authorities, and maybe afraid of law enforcement for very good reasons. So that also creates further disincentives for them to report. And in a study done of LGBTQ elders in Seattle, actually, 68% reported experiencing verbal harassment in their lifetimes, 43% had been threatened with violence, and African-American LGBT elders reported the highest level of lifetime LGBT-related discrimination. So it's really, for them, an even more severe situation. In care facilities, a study found that they had experienced a denial of visitors, refusal to allow their same-sex partner to share their room, refusal to allow a transgender elder be in a ward that matched their gender identity, and prevention of their partner being kept from their medical decision-making. So again, just another layer of barriers for them. So just again, that people with dementia are just that much more vulnerable to abuse for all of these reasons. I spoke once at a hospital in Seattle about sexual abuse of people with dementia, and someone reported how it was, I think, a nurse in a facility, and she talked about how a patient in the hospital had, I think she was in a hospital, had said she'd been sexually abused, and she said everyone just wrote it off because she had dementia, and so no one really believed her and responded as if she was telling the truth. And, you know, maybe it was true, maybe it wasn't, but no one investigated it, and that is a tragedy to me. We know that about half of people with dementia experience some form of abuse. These are just 3 slides that Laura Mosqueda wrote up, and I kind of added to from my own experience, but she's a geriatrician in California who just does amazing research and work in this issue. And she talks about how she's found in her studies that people who have early Alzheimer's disease or some other an early form of dementia of some kind, who are experiencing memory loss, short-term word loss, maybe some judgment impairment, are most likely to suffer financial abuse. And that definitely fits with my experience in my cases as well. It's usually people who are still living in the home, usually they're undiagnosed, but their judgment and their ability to make financial decisions is impaired, but no one really is aware of that. People who have moderate Alzheimer's or moderate dementia may have behavior changes, loss of insight, loss of inhibition. And with those people, physical abuse tends to be the crime that, or the act that happens most often. And then for people with advanced Alzheimer's, advanced dementia, who are really becoming bedbound, immobilized, suffering an inability to communicate, we see neglect and sexual abuse. And again, that's very true of my experience. And we know that any form of abuse, including financial exploitation, causes an increased risk of premature death in the elderly by 300%. And I can just say that certainly we see that in our physical abuse cases and a lot of our sexual abuse cases, but it's the financial exploitation cases that surprised me when I read this study until I started seeing it in my own cases. And what we find is that so many of the victims that we work with who have lost their life savings and really lost everything they've worked for, when they're exploited, especially by someone that they trust and maybe love, that shame and that sense of loss and embarrassment is really, really devastating to people. And people often lose their desire to carry on and to start over again at that point. So getting into just some red flags and signs of different forms of abuse, I'm just going to mention a couple of key points here. But what we know from Laura Mosqueda, again, is a bruising study that she did a number of years ago. And what she did was study 101 seniors for 6 weeks between about a 9-month time period, and studied the bruising that they had on their bodies. And what they found were that 90% of the bruises were on extremities. And this is for the accidental bruises. There were no bruises that were accidental on the neck, ears, genitalia, or soles of the feet. And if the bruises were on their trunk, they were more likely to know the cause of them. This is the location of bruises that they found caused by abuse. So it's the front of the body and the back of the body. And what they concluded was that inflicted bruises tended to be larger. Those over 5 centimeters in diameter were suspicious. That you cannot stage the age of a bruise by its color. So a lot of people say, well, it's yellow, so it's got to be X number of days old. And they really debunked that in this study. She also found that we've got to pay attention to the location of the bruise, as that diagram shows. Bruising and, in the front of the arms is fairly normal, on the shins is fairly normal, but the back of the body, not so much. The trunk, the head, places like that were not normal sites for accidental bruising to occur. She also said that people who were abused were much more likely to remember the cause of the bruising. And that was even true for people with dementia. In another study done by people who she worked with, they found that people with dementia were better able to remember traumatic events than non-traumatic events. So again, to me, that goes to the importance of listening to people when they talk about having been abused or neglected, even if they've got moderate to severe dementia. And these are just the locations to watch out for when you see bruising. We see a lot of cases of sexual abuse, but still not as many as we do cases of financial exploitation or physical abuse in our office. The sexual abuse we see most often, again, with people with advanced dementia. Some of the physical signs that we have identified are obviously bruising in unusual locations, bite marks, torn, stained bedding, unexplained STDs or HIV. All of those things are very consistent with some form of sexual abuse. Behavioral clues such as unexplained or sudden changes in mood or personal hygiene, avoidance or fear of specific people, hypervigilance, shying away from being touched, or speaking of the perpetrator in romantic terms. We got one case that I actually was not able to prosecute, but where a woman had severe dementia and was in a long-term care facility. And a former neighbor of hers, who she didn't know very well, but who knew her family, had started coming in to visit her. And she started talking about him as her boyfriend. And she was in her late 80s and he was in his 50s. And he was caught tightening up his belt and pulling his pants up one day in her room. And we didn't have enough evidence to prosecute him. We didn't have DNA or anything that could show that he'd actually done anything. But her daughter was absolutely convinced that he was having a sexual relationship with her mom, and her mom had no idea what was going on, except she thought he was a boyfriend. We've had other cases where a son-in-law was coming into a facility and having a sexual relationship with his mother-in-law, having sex with his mother-in-law. I should say raping her, because she was so demented she couldn't consent. And we were able to prosecute him, but he had gone in there for months before anyone really thought this was happening, because no one wanted to believe it was happening. Common perpetrators, again, we do see children, family members occasionally who are typically men. There's also issues of spouses sexually abusing their spouses, and that's really a complicated issue. I don't know if you guys heard about the case in Iowa, probably 4 or 5 years ago, where a husband was prosecuted for having sex with his wife. She had dementia, fairly advanced, and he was living outside of the facility. And the facility got very upset when they found this out. And her daughter got very upset about it. He was not her father. He'd been married to her mom for about 7 or 8 years. And so she reported to the police, and he was prosecuted, and he was eventually acquitted because the jury found that he did not have that they had a relationship, and she had enough understanding, despite her dementia, to be consenting. And she was showing no signs of not wanting to have this contact. And the jury just felt that the state had not shown that this was unwanted. So it's super complicated. But I think the most important thing is being aware of it and remembering that, sexual abuse of older adults is not infrequent. But older adults are also sexual beings. So many people with dementia do have the capacity to consent to sex. So there's a woman named, her name's Regina Koepp, K-O-E-P-P, who's doing some really wonderful work on this area. We had her come speak to our elder abuse group remotely, and she did it for free, and she was absolutely wonderful. But what she talked about is the importance of getting a multidisciplinary response to cases like this. So if you're working with someone who has dementia and is reporting a consensual relationship, or you're aware of a consensual sexual relationship, have her evaluated by a capacity evaluator who can really give a deep, thorough analysis of whether she has the capacity to consent. and have a multidisciplinary team respond, have the social workers be part of it and her doctors and everyone, get everyone's input so you can make a really adequate decision because it's incredibly complicated. What we don't want to be doing is saying, you know, no, you can't dye your hair blue, and no, you can't have a sex life just because you have mild dementia. So it's a very delicate area and one that we in our office are trying to deal with in a really responsible and thoughtful way, but it's difficult. So on the neglect front, going back to Ruby Wise, these are signs of possible neglect. I'm sure you all have seen these in different degrees in your jobs, but I would say the most common that we see in our cases, which again are the very far end of the spectrum, are pressure sores, dehydration, and malnutrition. And usually with these kinds of signs, it's not one or two. Pressure sores on their own, you know, can happen even with the best of care, obviously. So it's not till you start seeing other signs and symptoms that it becomes concerning. So when a case of neglect may be criminal is when there are multiple signs of serious neglect. So multiple advanced, untreated or improperly treated pressure sores on unlikely locations. I had a case once where an older man who was sort of being cared for by his son fell in the bathroom and was in the bathroom lying face down on the floor for over 24 hours and actually developed pressure sores on his face. We've had cases where patients being cared for by their family members who are being paid by the state in Washington were being kept face down on their bed and developed pressure sores on their knees. So those kinds of things are pretty much inherently red flags, as you all know, I'm sure. Sepsis, osteomyelitis, things that are getting that infected usually are not happening with proper care. And those are things that really ought to be reported. And then the other thing that I have found in my career, and for a number of years, I just prosecuted neglect cases, and most of the cases I got, I did not prosecute, because what we saw were a lot of cases where the system was failing this elder, not the caregiver so much. We had cases where adult children were suddenly thrust into the role of caregiver and they had developmental disabilities because they were living at home and never left home. Or they had some other issues, physical issues, where they really couldn't provide care to their parent, but they were thrown into this role of being a caregiver. And those are the people to me that we should not be prosecuting. But when you see someone like Christopher Wise, who is keeping their parent home and sacrificing good care so that they can inherit from them or so that they can keep getting their monthly income, that's a different story. And that's always a factor that we talk to detectives about. Any questions about any of this or comments so far? Okay. I'm going to move on now and talk about financial exploitation. And you might think that you in the healthcare field, you know, don't really have anything to do with this, but I would say that doctors are our strongest partners in many of these cases, and I'll talk to you about why. We know that financial exploitation is even less seldom reported than general elder abuse, that only 1 in 43 cases is ever reported to the system. One study in New York found that, this studied almost 1,000 cases that APS had, that in 35% of the financial exploitation cases, the victims live with the perpetrators. In 67% of those cases, family members were the perpetrators. Half of those victims were largely unaware of their mistreatment, and only 2% of the referrals were initiated by the victims themselves. And I think that goes back to what we talked about earlier about this, you know, the hesitancy people who are being exploited or abused feel in reporting. Some signs of financial exploitation, and again, usually multiple are present, are where the victim has a new best friend or love interest, where they're suddenly estranged from their family or friends. And the reason for this is because we see a lot of people who are exploiting elders who turn them against their family and convince them their kids just want their money, and I'm the one who's here taking care of you, I'm the one who's here for you. And so that what results is that the elder starts getting confused about that and starts mistrusting their friends and trusting this exploiter. And especially when dementia is involved, I think that's a really common thing that happens. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Anyone is, yeah, okay. What we also see in people who are being exploited is loss of interest in their former activities. They stop going to church or playing bridge. And really their old selves start disappearing in some ways as they're kind of taken over by this person. And then of course, hand in hand with that is significant change in their spending patterns. They stop tending to their bills. And most often we see a change of power of attorney. And that's, I would say, the biggest red flag that I see in my practice is the person who's the new person in their life, or the exploiter, will take them to a new attorney, even though they've got a longtime attorney they've used and they've appointed their kids as then the people who will inherit from them and who are their powers of attorney. The exploiter says, look, I know a great attorney. Let's go there and take care of this. Your kids are not trustworthy. I'll take care of you. Let's make me your attorney, in fact. And unethical elder law attorneys who, are in it to make some money will just sign off and appoint this new power of attorney, and suddenly the kids are cut out of the parents' finances. I had a case we just recently took to trial where the victim was in his, I think he was 97 and wheelchair bound, and his caregiver took him to a new attorney, even though he had a friend who'd done all of his legal paperwork for decades, took him to a new attorney, and his children were his powers of attorney for decades. And this new attorney just signed up, created these new documents, appointing the caregiver as his power of attorney, and never reached out to his former attorney, never reached out to his children or anything. So that for me is just really wrong. And these attorneys need to be held accountable for that. That attorney in our trial ended up testifying for the defense because she said, oh, I didn't notice anything wrong with him, with Mo. He seemed totally fine. And when we asked her why he seemed fine, she said, well, he nodded in response to everything I said, and he smiled. And so I felt like we were connecting. And so that was, to me, indicative of the fact that he understood what he was doing. So it's really something to look out for. And then what you all may see more of is missed medical appointments, deterioration in care and self-care. You may also see the caregiver, who's the exploiter, bringing the patient in for appointments and speaking over them and kind of controlling the conversation. And that's another red flag that we see fairly often. These are just some common methods of financial exploitation. Scams by strangers obviously are incredibly common. Embezzlement by people who are legitimately in control of the elder's assets. And this is something that people often, again, don't understand, is that if someone is a power of attorney or a guardian or an accountant, and you are legitimately handling an elder's finances, you have a fiduciary duty to spend that person's money on them and for their best interests. So if you ever hear law enforcement say to you, oh, they've got a power of attorney that's civil, it's wrong, it's criminal. And there are actually easier cases for us to prove when there's a power of attorney, because there's such a clear duty outlined in the power of attorney document. Sometimes there's a gifting provision in that document that says that the attorney, in fact, or the power of attorney, can gift themselves, $500 a year. If they then go ahead and gift themselves $10,000 or $100,000, that's theft. So it's something to really watch out for. And you may hear from law enforcement just a misunderstanding about that if they respond to a case like that. And then we have these cases of undue influence where someone kind of takes over the elder's life and exerts control over their decision-making in order to obtain their assets. And that's also quite common in our cases. And these are just some sort of factors to be aware of as far as helping you know when something might be criminal. Obviously, we have the right to give our money to whoever we want to, and our kids might be really pissed off if we give our money to our caregiver who we've had for 20 years. But we have the right to do that so long as we have capacity and so long as we're not being lied to when we give them that money. But if a perpetrator tells lies to a victim and says, I really need the money for my daughter, she's having surgery and it's costing us, $20,000, and then my grandson needs drug treatment, and there's all these stories being told by the perpetrator, and we can show that those stories are lies, and the elder gives them money based on those lies, that's theft. So those are also cases that really need to be investigated and hopefully prosecuted. Yes. Sure. I think if it's the person's attorney they've had forever and they're going to change their will, it's never going to hurt, and there's going to be a trust relationship between the attorney and the client. So they're not going to disclose anything to the social worker. But if, for instance, the person has dementia and that might be not something that's not known to the attorney, I think telling them that would be a really important thing to do. It's amazing how unskilled lay people are at determining when someone has dementia. So we just see all these cases, like I mentioned, where an attorney just signs off on paperwork and just assumes the person has the ability to do that. The other thing is, again, if it's someone else, if they're aware of a patient being taken to a different attorney, what I would do is call the original attorney. If you can find out from the family who their original attorney is, let them know what's happening, and they can then reach out to the new attorney. So it's really a wonderful thing to do, I think. So again, when a perpetrator has control of an elder's money and uses it for themselves, that's also theft. When an elder's consent to give money is based on coercion or manipulation or undue influence, that's theft. When an elder's assets are taken without their knowledge or without their permission. So an example of that would be if an elder is giving a caregiver their debit card and says, you can buy groceries with this. And then the caregiver goes out and buys themselves a Maserati. That is obviously theft because it's going beyond the scope of what the permission was. And then where the elder lacks the capacity to consent to give the perpetrator their money. And this is trickier because we have to show that the perpetrator knew they lacked capacity, but it's something we always pursue. We routinely have law enforcement get the victim or the elder to a capacity evaluator, someone who's really got experience assessing dementia and can give us an opinion on whether that person had the ability to make that decision. And then we also do a videotaped interview of the victim so that the jury can see 2 years later just how impaired they were. Because inevitably our suspect, our defendant, is going to say, oh, they knew what they were doing at the time. Their dementia has just gotten a lot worse over the years. But when we have that video showing them saying, you know, I don't know what my address is, I can't remember what I did this morning, that's incredibly important. And in the same vein, you all documenting signs of dementia that you see, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but any signs of dementia that you may see is gold for us because we've got to be able to show how impaired this person was at the time of the abuse or the exploitation. And we know that financial capacity is one of the first capacities to go when someone is developing a dementia. And that oftentimes their declining financial skills are detectable before anyone is diagnosed. So it's really subtle in many cases, but what we often see is people with a frontal lobe dementia who seem completely fine, and APS says, oh, I don't know, they're not in our state of vulnerable adult. They can, you know, care for themselves. Their house is clean, they're cooking. But when we have them evaluated, it turns out they have moderate dementia and they no longer have financial capacity. So it's really important for us to be talking to you all so you are aware of that because it's very subtle in many cases. And the other thing is I bring up the MMSE here, the mini mental state exam, because our APS uses it in many cases and many of the PCPs that I work with use it. And what I found in my cases is that it oftentimes gives a false positive and that people do quite well on it, even though they may be really suffering from impaired judgment as a result of dementia. And what I understand, and I'm no expert on this, I think Marla will be able to tell you much better than I can, but is that the MMSE really picks up on memory loss, but not so much on frontal lobe impairment that can also come with dementia. So what we love are the SLUMS, which I think Marla will also talk about, the MoCA, the frontal lobe. There's a test called the frontal assessment battery. Those tests are much better at picking up someone's impairment that affects their financial decisions. As far as healthcare providers are concerned, you guys to me are our best partners. You are in a really unique position to be detecting elder abuse, neglect, and exploitation. A lot of times you're the only person outside of the elder's family or this dyad they may be in with a caregiver who may be an abuser who sees them. You may be the only one they trust enough to disclose their victimization to. You may be the first person they see after something has happened. And they're also, you tend to be less uncomfortable with direct questions from healthcare providers. I think I can't emphasize enough how much better access to information you have from people who are being victimized. So what you can do is consider the possibility that what you're seeing could be caused by financial exploitation, abuse, or neglect. When you see an injury or you see signs of neglect or signs of financial distress, ask yourself if abuse, neglect, or exploitation is a possible explanation for what's going on. Document, and this is so important because really in all of our cases, we're getting records from nursing homes, from long-term care facilities, from primary care providers, from clinics. Those records are always relevant to every case we handle because you guys are the ones who are seeing so many of these different things, and you're seeing signs of cognitive impairment, which is really crucial to every one of our cases. So if someone's missing their appointments, like Ruby Wise stopped going to the doctor, so that documentation of the efforts they made to reach out to her, her doctor made to reach out to her, were really important to us. The instructions that were given to Christopher, the caregiver, about what he should be doing, very, very important. Obviously, signs of neglect or abuse, signs of cognitive impairment, concerns about a caregiver's behavior, if they seem usually controlling or they seem like they're minimizing things that you may be seeing. And then statements of the patient and the caregiver in quotes, because the other thing that oftentimes people who are in healthcare don't realize is that we can get statements in from a victim to you without you're even having to testify. Those records, we can get admitted in court. And if a victim says to you, if an elder says to you, you know, I'm really, I'm hurting because my son twisted my arm the other day and threw me up against the wall, that statement can actually come in even without your testimony. And so that becomes really important in every step of our assessing a case and figuring out whether we should be prosecuting and then prosecuting that case. And then assess. If you have concerns about cognitive impairment, doing screening tests, sending the person out for a full-blown capacity evaluation, using the SLUMS or MOCA like I talked about, those things end up being absolutely crucial to us in almost every case we get. And the reason, I guess, in case it's not clear, I just want you to know the reason the cognitive aspect of things is so important to us is because in the vast majority of cases we get, what the perpetrator says is, this is what the victim wanted. They consented. They wanted to give me this money. They didn't want medical care. They wanted me to just leave them alone, like Christopher Wise left Ruby alone. They wanted to engage in whatever the sexual act is that occurred. It's consent is the defense that we see. So you can't give consent if you don't have capacity. So capacity is just absolutely central to our analyzing whether we should be filing charges and then to our proving a case against somebody. So reporting, I don't know, is anyone from APS here? APS is a crucial partner. We have a lot of cynicism towards our APS in Washington, but it's starting to get better. But even if you are cynical about them, just report anyway. If you're not happy with the response you get, go up the line and talk to a supervisor and just keep reporting. It's so important. And then we have a multidisciplinary team in King County, and I think there's some in Montana as well, where prosecutors, law enforcement, social workers, healthcare providers, and APS are coming together to staff cases. And because these cases are so darn complicated. And if you guys are willing to help out your local prosecutors, that is just such a benefit. So think about that and reach out. If there's an elder abuse detective you work with or ever hear from, offer your help in some of these cases because we need you desperately. This is a reminder about mandatory reporting in Montana, which I'm sure you all know about, but just also a reminder that you don't have to be right. In every state, I believe there is an exception for any kind of liability against a mandatory reporter if they report in good faith. So as long as you trust that what you're saying is true and you have a legitimate concern, it's safe to report. And it's not your job to make sure you're right. And then don't give up. Again, if you hear, call a supervisor if it's APS. If it's law enforcement, call a sergeant or call your local prosecutor's office if they have somebody who specializes in elder abuse. And you can also ask law enforcement to conduct a welfare check. If you're working with a patient who you haven't seen in a while, you can call the police and say, will you conduct a welfare check? And I've never heard them say no in response to that. And if someone had done that for Ruby Wise, the outcome might have been very different. So I think typically if it's an emergency, obviously you call 911, but otherwise you call the non-emergency line of whatever the police agency is in the jurisdiction where the victim lives or the elder lives. So I'm going to come back to Ruby and I'm probably going to end early. I know you guys are going to be upset about that. but I also want to have time for questions if anyone has any. So after a months-long, really exhaustive investigation, we did end up charging Christopher Wise with first-degree manslaughter, which is to recklessly cause the death of another person. And the investigation was thorough because we didn't have any person who was really going into the home and seeing Ruby. She was so isolated, and she had dementia, and she was all alone with him. And so we had to construct our case through looking at the bank records, looking at her PCP records, looking at the utilities, whether he was paying utilities, talking to his friends, talking to the referral service that offered him in-home care and long-term care facility care for his mother, and that he turned down, and every person we could find who he'd interacted with over the last year. And so it was a very difficult case for us to prove, but we went forward and he went to trial, and at trial he claimed again he was following his mom's wishes. And our response to that was, you know, it may be that Ruby didn't want to go to the hospital or didn't want to die in a long-term care facility, but no one wanted to die like that. There was no way she wanted to die starving and dehydrated and filthy and in pain. He claimed she was swaddled in love, and he portrayed himself as being the victim. There was a real martyrdom kind of thing going on, and a very narcissistic kind of theme in his testimony. And then we heard from these neighbors who said they could hear Ruby calling for help and assumed it was dementia, so they didn't worry about it too much. Again, going back to the ageism we've been hearing about a lot today. But the medical witnesses played a really crucial role in this case too. Ruby's primary care provider testified, and he described her condition and all the care he had recommended and she didn't receive. He talked about having to cut off her medications because he kept telling Christopher, you need to bring her in, and Christopher did not. Our medical examiner testified about the cause and manner of death and the condition of her body. And we hired a nurse with expertise in pressure sores who testified about how those sores should have been taken care of, what he should have done, what care he did not provide, and the pain and discomfort that Ruby must have experienced. And that was really hard for us because we had to bring her alive. And Christopher was alive the whole time. He was crying, and he testified for about a day and a half, and he brought his friends in to say how much he loved Ruby, but we really didn't have anyone to testify for Ruby. So her journals and this nurse who could talk about what her experience was like were really crucial for us. So the jury found him guilty, which was, thank God they did, but I was very grateful for that. They found him guilty of the second-degree manslaughter, which is criminal negligence instead of recklessness. And I can talk to you about that later, but recklessness really doesn't fit with neglect. And since this case has happened, we have gotten our neglect statute, which is not the homicide statute, but the less serious neglect statute, amended to change the element from recklessness to criminal negligence because of cases like this. So it made a difference. And he was given a high-end sentence, which at that time was 39 months in prison. So not very much, but something. And for us, since it was the first kind of case like this that we had brought, it felt good. And it felt like it was saying to the community, this is something we will not tolerate. So that's all I have. If anyone has any questions at any point about a case or just needs help with anything, I love working with communities and talking to law enforcement and healthcare and prosecutors. So if I can ever help you, don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you all so much. And I guess we have a few more minutes if there's questions. Any questions from anybody else? Yeah.
So can you ask? Yeah, Paige, can you please make sure that you repeat the question?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Can't hear. Oh, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so she's asking if the elder does not have dementia and her son is abusing her. What? Okay, her son is caring for her. Okay, so she's getting care from the son. It's not quality care. It's concerning, but she doesn't want any help. You know, I think she has that right. I mean, what I feel like is if someone is not being physically harmed, then, you know, she can choose whether she wants to continue in that situation if she has capacity. The thing to watch out for in a case like that is there anything else going on? For instance, is he also financially exploiting her and no one knows about it? And what we see a lot of times in cases like that is the son who's the caregiver also has a gambling addiction or a drug addiction. And when you see that, that kind of can change the picture of things. Or he's threatening her and telling her, if you tell anybody what I'm doing to you, then you're going to pay later. Doesn't sound like that's what's happening here. So if that's true, I mean, you can always report it and let her talk to APS and tell them, what her decision making is. A lot of what APS tends to be moving towards as far as assessing capacity is, what is the decision at issue here? And does it make sense? Does her reasoning for why she's making this decision make sense? So if she can say to APS, yes, I know it's substandard care, but I want my son to be with me. I really don't want anyone else in the house. And she can really articulate a reason for that makes sense and that's rational, then she does have the right to live that way. But it's just that there's so often other things going on that it's really hard to tell. One thing we have in our community, I don't know if you all have this in yours, is we have an advocate who just works with elders in the community. So if there's a case of someone being neglected or abused and she's not willing to participate, we ask if this advocate can go out and just start working with her and trying to build her trust and talking to her about what's happening. And that can also result in some more reporting further down the line, just through her becoming more empowered. But it's tricky. It's tricky. Yeah. My guess is because there's so many people who have undiagnosed dementia, whose families don't realize it, whose doctors don't realize it. So they're out there living in the community still. And if they're alone and they're not really protected, they are prime victims of exploitation because their decision-making is impaired and they're lonely and they're vulnerable. So I think it just tends to be the most common scenario we see. And people with moderate to advanced dementia, usually their finances have been protected. There's a guardian in place or a power of attorney in place and they're protected. But it's those people who are still in the home, but who are impaired, who are not protected financially yet. Yeah, Marla. Well, a lot of times what we see is there's other things going on. There's different prongs of theft in every state, in Montana as well. So you can prove theft by deception, like the person lied to the victim, or you can prove theft by embezzlement if they had power of attorney and they use the funds for themselves, or theft by without consent, which is incapacity. So if we have deception or if we have a fiduciary relationship, we just prove it that way. But if the only theory we have is that the victim really was consenting, but they were too demented to consent, then we prove it by getting a full-blown capacity evaluation done by someone who's got expertise in dementia, by getting their primary care provider records and seeing if they've been noting any concerns, by interviewing the victim and recording that interview, by talking to friends and family and neighbors about things they've noticed. And we just try to gather as much circumstantial evidence as we can, but it's difficult, yeah.
Paige, can you be sure to repeat the questions?
Oh, I'm sorry. So that Marla's question was, how do we prove when our theory is that the victim lacked capacity in a financial exploitation case, how do we prove that they lacked capacity? So that's through an evaluation, interviewing the victim, talking to family members, and getting records from the primary care provider.
Perfect, thank you. We do have a question here.
Okay.
Credentials for capacity evaluations. That's all I'm asking.
I'm asking about credentials for capacity evaluation, as in who is able to do that?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it depends on the state. I think there's laws in each state. So you need to look, I don't know what the Montana laws are about that, but if you have an attorney, an elder law attorney you work with, they will know the answer to that for sure. In our case, we don't need someone who's like court certified to testify. So we have a woman who's got a licensed social worker who works with elders by going in the home and assessing them and making recommendations. And it serves a purpose for us. She's very skilled. She administers all their proper screening tests, and she is able to tell us what her opinion is on financial capacity, and we can use it in our criminal cases. But if it's a guardianship situation or a conservatorship situation, you may need to get someone who is authorized by your state statute.
Thank you.
Okay.
We have one more question from Missoula.
wondering if there is any funding to help prosecuting or county prosecuting to take these cases. Because I don't think
Okay.
we have anybody who specifically looks at elder abuse in this county. Do you know of funding that would help?
Yes. There's such a pathetic amount of funding, as you guys probably know, for research and for projects involving older adults. But there is one that the Office on Violence Against Women has a grant that they offer, and it's a really wonderful grant. I work on it as well. And it's basically training a whole community in recognizing and responding to elder abuse. And they have an annual offering, basically a solicitation every year. So if you look up OVW and their grant is called Abuse in Later Life, they offer, I think, about $300,000 over a 3-year period to train APS, law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, and direct service providers. So it's a really wonderful program, and that is what allowed us to boost our number of prosecutors up to 2.5. We were only 1 before that, but because we got that grant, it really inspired us to focus more on the issue. So I would highly recommend that. We also offer through that grant, we offer a prosecutor's course on elder abuse, and we're going to be doing that, and it's free. We're doing that next February in DC. So if anyone has questions about that, feel free to email me and I can give you more information on that. Yes, that is great. So she's saying that in the training for notaries, because out of concerns of financial exploitation happening, they were told the best practice was to separate themselves from the person who brought the elder in to notarize the document and talk to them alone and ask them, you know, why are you doing this? What are your reasons for this? I think that is an absolutely wonderful idea. And I hear a lot of people talking to doctors as well in elder abuse training saying, do the same thing with your patients, talk to your patients alone. If there's a caregiver who seems intrusive and like they're answering a lot for the patient, ask if you can talk to the patient alone. But I think that's absolutely great advice. I had a case I recently prosecuted where a son took his mom who was dying of cancer and she was on hospice at home and she was on a morphine drip, and he took her out of the home to a notary to change her will to make him the beneficiary. And if that notary had reported, we would have been able to stop it, but she didn't. So I think that's great advice.
All right, Paige, I think there's probably 1,000 questions that could keep coming, but just to stay on schedule, I'm going to go ahead and close
Okay.
the session. Okay. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you all so much.